Hello class. Again, I'm sorry I'm not there with you this week, and I'm sorry it took me so long to post this video, but what I wanted to go ahead and do tonight is I just wanted to go ahead and kind of finish up our discussion of the Jacksonian era so that we could start with the next thing fresh on Tuesday, which frankly I'm not sure if it's the, I have to check the syllabus. It's either the Great Awakening or the Second Great Awakening or the Westward Expansion. Either way, it'd be really fun. We'll start on that on Tuesday. So what I want to do, I'm actually going to back up just a little bit, and we're just going to talk about Jackson and his terms and the things that he did. And just a reminder, I honestly really hate Andrew Jackson, so that will probably come out in this. So we'll start again with the election of 1828 that we talked about last time. Jackson touted his humble origins. He made an alliance with John C. Calhoun, who we talked about as the staunch defender of the South, the guy that basically coined the term peculiar institution. But they come together so they could defeat Adams and Clay. That's my sister's cat there. A strategy by Martin Van Buren. Jackson spoke of the stolen election of 1824 and attacked Adams for having dubious morals. It became a very ugly campaign. Jackson wins an electoral landslide. It really, frankly, wasn't close. Many people came to his inauguration, as we talked about the other day, and Jackson was very much seen as the people's president. It ushered in what they called the reign of King Mob. And he will use patronage to reward his supporters. He called it the spoil system. So basically, instead of, like Adams had basically tried to give people jobs who deserved jobs and could do the jobs, Jackson was more interested in rewarding his followers. Martin Van Buren became his Secretary of State. Early on, Jackson faces a challenge from South Carolina. In 1828, Congress had actually passed a tariff that the South had not liked. We talked about this the other day too. The South Carolina legislature put out a protest. Calhoun and others argued that the state can nullify the tariffs. States' rights becomes a major debate in the Senate. Daniel Webster of Massachusetts attacked the notion of states' rights, while Southerners tended to support it. Many looked to Jackson to see where he would stand. He was a federal general, but he was also from the South. So in a toast to honor Jefferson, Jackson said at a dinner, "Our federal union, it must be preserved." It made it very clear that he supported the supremacy of the federal government. This forces John C. Calhoun to resign as vice president to become a senator from South Carolina. The problem rises up again with the Tariff Act of 1832, which actually Jackson signed, though he doesn't like tariffs, but the reason he signed it is because it was a compromise that lowered the tariffs. But still, South Carolina decided to be difficult about it. They held a convention and they nullified the law. Jackson denounces it. He is angry. He privately said if South Carolina caused trouble, he would hang the first South Carolinian troublemaker he could find, and by God, he hoped it was John C. Calhoun. I think I mentioned the other day, Jackson's two regrets on his deathbed was that he didn't shoot Henry Clay and didn't hang John C. Calhoun. Those were his two regrets. Congress passed the Force Bill, which gave the President Jackson the right to use force in South Carolina. Henry Clay, however, worked out a compromise. And the kind of ironic thing here, and I don't actually think I mentioned this the other day, is I think first Jackson was angry that he didn't get to go down and smack South Carolina around. And like I said the other day, sometimes I wonder if we would have been better off if he had. But here's the ironic thing. South Carolina wanted to be South Carolina. So they actually held another convention and they nullified the Force Bill. which was a direct insult to Jackson. Fortunately, Jackson did not take it as an insult. So, that's kind of what's going on early on. One thing that is definitely for sure, Jackson is not kind to Native Americans or Indians. Basically, he only cares about the white man's democracy. And for white men, it was a very vibrant, working democracy. Unfortunately, only for white men. In 1821, New York had abolished property requirements for white males to vote, though at the same time they actually raised them for black men to make it more difficult for them to vote. African Americans also lost the right to vote in Rhode Island in 1822 and Pennsylvania in 1838. They also set limits on free blacks in Indiana. Basically, if you were black and you wanted to visit Indiana for, I don't even know why anyone would visit Indiana. It is a terrible, terrible place. That's right, I said it. But if you were a black man visiting Indiana, you had to post a bond before you entered the state. So you see what I mean by that this is definitely a white man's democracy. In Illinois, they barred African Americans from the courts, so did Ohio. However, the number of free African Americans in the North and West continue to increase. Now, I mentioned that Jackson treats Native Americans very poorly, and he saw them as inferior to whites. Now, this isn't an uncommon idea. We saw it with Jefferson, too. One thing that Jackson had done is he had seized 23 million acres of land owned by a tribe called the Creek, C-R-E-E-K, during what was called the Creek War. He treated them as conquered subjects. Many Indian tribes had actually tried to adopt American ways in order to avoid conflict. They had tried to assimilate into what we would call the white man's democracy, the white man's Christian society. The ones who assimilated the most were what we call the 5 civilized tribes. You probably have heard of them. They show up in a lot of country songs. The Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Seminoles, the Creeks, and the Chickasaws. Many of them even converted to Christianity. Heck, the Cherokee actually kept African slaves. The Cherokees were the most assimilated. Well, the Cherokees at one point in Georgia declared themselves an independent republic. The state of Georgia did not like this. And one of the reasons they didn't like it is because in 1828 they found gold on their land, in the Cherokee land. Soon, white prospectors came to stake a claim on the Cherokee land. Georgia actually passes a law to strip the Cherokee of their sovereignty, and they created what was called a Georgia Guard to patrol the Indian land. The tribe began to look to the opponents of Jackson for help, and even went to court. While waiting for the courts, Jackson refused federal troops to send federal troops to protect them, and he began his plans for removal. He will not force them to stay, but he will make it impossible for the Indians in the East to he won't force them to leave, but he will basically make it impossible for them to stay. Many in Congress, including Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, and others, opposed him. Protestant clergy often opposed this Indian removal. And the big problem is, and this all begins with what's called the Indian Removal Act of 1830, where basically we told the Native American tribes, the Cherokees and others, that they could trade their land in the east for some land west of the Mississippi River, and we're like, you don't have to worry about that. That land is totally yours forever. We pinky swear. You all probably know how that worked out. So, we passed the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This will begin what is known as the Trail of Tears, which actually is very close to our area, you can pick up different parts of the Trail of Tears in surrounding counties. Christian County, Kentucky even has a car tour that you can do with audio. I haven't done it, but I'm sure it's very depressing. So, while all of this is going on, these Native Americans are told if they stayed, they would have no protection. I mentioned the Cherokees sought relief in federal courts, even going to the Supreme Court in 2 different cases. The first was Cherokee Nation versus Georgia in 1830, and the other case was 1832 Worcester versus Georgia. And Worcester is spelled, in case y'all don't have the sauce, W-O-R-C-E-S-T-E-R. Now, what the court ruled is that the Cherokees had the rights of some sovereign nations, but not the right to sue the state of Georgia. So they basically, instead of taking a stand, they threw it out on a technicality in what I think was a major act of cowardice on the part of the courts. Now, the other case is a little bit different because it involved actual U.S. citizens. A guy named Samuel Worcester, W-O-R-C-E-S-T-E-R, and a person named, and I'll have to spell this because it's Elizur, E-L-I-Z-U-R, Butler. They were arrested for living on Indian land without a permit. Now, what the court found in that case was that they had been wrongly imprisoned. They said that the Georgia law had no force on